Imagine an empire on the verge of collapse. Now, picture one man standing before a microphone, his greatest fear about to be broadcast to millions of anxious ears. He was a king who never wanted the crown, a leader who wrestled with his own voice. This is the story of how a stuttering, reluctant monarch became the steady, defiant voice of a nation at war, uniting his people through their darkest hour. And no, this isn't quite the story you know from the movies, which often have to squeeze timelines for dramatic effect. This is the deeper story of how Prince Albert, known to his family as Bertie, became King George VI and, against all odds, the voice of a generation. It's hard to overstate the power of a single voice in a time of crisis. In an age before the internet and rolling news cycles, the radio was the most intimate link between a leader and their people. For Great Britain in 1939, that connection was everything. As the shadow of Nazism fell across Europe, the nation desperately needed a voice of reassurance, strength, and resolve. What they found was a king who was terrified of public speaking, a man whose personal battle was about to collide with a global catastrophe. His journey from a private man hobbled by a speech impediment to a global symbol of defiance is one of the most incredible transformations in modern history. To understand the man who would become Britain's wartime voice, we have to go back to 1936, a year of crisis for the monarchy. Prince Albert, the Duke of York, was never supposed to be king. He was a quiet family man, the second son of King George V. The throne was destined for his older brother, the charismatic David, who became King Edward VIII. Bertie was content with a life outside the spotlight, partly because of a demon he'd battled since childhood, a severe stammer. This made every public speech an ordeal, a source of deep personal frustration. For years, Bertie had sought help. As many now know from the film The King's Speech, he started working with an unconventional Australian speech therapist, Lionel Logue. But their work together didn't begin in the frantic run-up to war. It began much earlier, in the 1920s. Logue's methods went beyond simple exercises. He gave the Duke the psychological support to manage his impediment, a partnership that would prove essential. This private struggle was violently thrown into the public eye by the abdication crisis. King Edward VIII was determined to marry Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American. For the British establishment and the Church of England, this was simply unthinkable. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin made it clear the king had to choose between the crown and the woman he loved. To the world's shock, Edward chose love. He gave up the throne, declaring it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love. His father, King George V, had reportedly once grimly predicted that his eldest son would ruin himself within 12 months of his death. In less than a year, those words had come true. On December 11, 1936, the shy, stammering Bertie became King George VI. It wasn't a promotion, it was a sentence. He was horrified, writing in his diary, "I am new to the job, but I hope that time will be my friend." He felt totally unprepared for the task so suddenly forced upon him. The crown was a burden he never wanted, and the microphone was an instrument of torture he would now have to master. The people of Britain and its empire remembered the Great War and the immense sacrifice it demanded. Now it was happening all over again. In this moment, the king's role was far more than ceremonial. His voice, broadcast by radio into every home, was a unifying force, a direct link to the heart of the nation. The government could make laws and the generals could plan battles, but it was the king who had to embody the spirit of the people and steady their nerve. This placed an almost unbearable weight on George VI. He knew the first great test of his reign was here. He would have to address the nation at the most critical moment in its modern history. On September 3, 1939, after an ultimatum to Germany went unanswered, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain announced that Britain was at war. That evening, at 6 p.m., it was the king's turn. He knew millions would be gathered around their radios, desperate for guidance. The speech was ready, and Lionel Logue was by his side, coaching him to the very end. This wasn't just a royal duty. It was the moment the reluctant king had to find his voice, and in doing so, help a nation find its own. As the red light blinked on in a small room in Buckingham Palace, King George VI stood before the microphone. He began, his tone solemn and measured. "In this grave hour, perhaps the most fateful in our history," he started, "I send to every household of my peoples this message spoken with the same depth of feeling for each one of you as if I were able to cross your threshold and speak to you myself." The speech's power was in its moral clarity and deeply personal feel. The king explained that every effort for peace had been tried and failed. Britain was forced into a conflict, he said, to stand against a principle that would be fatal to any civilized order in the world. He framed the enemy's ideology in stark terms. Such a principle, stripped of all disguise, is surely the mere primitive doctrine that might is right. This wasn't a war for territory, he explained, but a fight for the survival of freedom itself. He acknowledged the hardship to come, warning, there may be dark days ahead. Yet, his main plea was for unity. "I ask them to stand calm and firm and united in this time of trial." The delivery wasn't perfect. You could hear the immense strain in his voice, the careful navigation of each word. But that imperfection became his greatest strength. It wasn't the slick speech of a politician. It was the sincere, determined voice of a man doing his duty in spite of his fear, mirroring the very spirit the country would need. He concluded with a spiritual appeal, committing the nation's cause to God. "With God's help," he finished, "we shall prevail." When the broadcast ended, a wave of relief swept the nation. The king had done it. He had spoken for them all. His struggle was their struggle. His resolve was their resolve. In those 9 minutes, the accidental king had finally become their sovereign. That first wartime speech was the beginning of a conversation. Throughout the war, the king's broadcasts became a source of comfort for the British people. His 1939 Christmas message, delivered during the tense, phony war, ended with a poem given to him by his daughter, Princess Elizabeth. "I said to the man who stood at the gate of the year, 'Give me a light that I may tread safely into the unknown.' And he replied, 'Go out into the darkness and put your hand into the hand of God. That shall be better than light and safer than a known way.'" But his leadership was defined by more than just words. His actions, especially during the Blitz of 1940, gave his broadcasts an unshakable authenticity. While the government urged the royal family to flee to Canada, the king and queen flatly refused. Queen Elizabeth famously declared, "The children won't go without me, I won't leave the king, and the king will never leave." They stayed in London, sharing the danger. That shared danger became terrifyingly real on September 13, 1940. A German bomber dove low and dropped its payload directly on Buckingham Palace. 6 bombs fell, with one obliterating the private chapel. The king and queen were nearly killed. Yet, this attack, meant to demoralize the nation, did the exact opposite. After inspecting the damage, Queen Elizabeth made a remark that became legendary. "I am glad we have been bombed," she said. "It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." The people of London's working-class East End had been bearing the brunt of the bombing. The Queen's comment was a stunning statement of solidarity. The King and Queen toured bomb sites across the country, offering quiet words of encouragement. Their presence in the rubble, sharing the same risks, forged an unbreakable bond with the public. Now, when the king spoke on the radio, his words carried the weight of shared suffering. He wasn't just their king, he was one of them. If you found this piece of hidden history interesting, and the story of how a reluctant man rose to meet his destiny, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And let us know in the comments which other historical figures or events you'd like us to explore in our next video. Your engagement helps us continue to bring these incredible stories to light. After nearly 6 long years, the war in Europe was over. On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. Jubilant crowds flooded the streets of London. That evening, King George VI came to the microphone one more time, but his message now was one of gratitude and sober reflection. "Today we give thanks to Almighty God for a great deliverance," he began, his voice full of emotion. He spoke from the heart of a city that was war-battered, but never for one moment daunted or dismayed. This wasn't a speech of triumph, but of profound thanks. He paid tribute to the Allies and the Commonwealth, but his most moving words were for those who had paid the ultimate price. "Let us remember those who will not come back," he said. "We have come to the end of our tribulation, and they are not with us at the moment of our rejoicing." He also praised the civilians on the home front, thanking them for carrying their burdens unflinchingly without complaint. And he reminded everyone that the war against Japan was not yet won, balancing celebration with a call for continued resolve. He framed the entire struggle as a fight for the cause of every land where freedom is cherished and law and liberty go hand in hand. It was a speech that perfectly captured the nation's mood: immense relief, proud sorrow, and a quiet determination to build a peace worthy of the sacrifice. The story of King George VI during the Second World War is about how a profound personal challenge became a national strength. The shy Prince Albert, who dreaded public speaking, was called to lead his people through their darkest hour. He was never a thundering orator like Winston Churchill, but he offered something just as vital: a voice of quiet sincerity, shared struggle, and unshakable duty. His broadcasts were a lifeline. His hesitation and effort, once a source of private shame, became a public symbol of the nation's own grit and endurance. He was the reluctant king who, by conquering his own fears, helped an entire empire conquer theirs. His legacy isn't written in grand treaties, but in the memory of a steady voice that gave a people the courage to prevail.